Welcome to Double Trouble. My name is Dr. Devlen. I'm the director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Double Trouble is Macdonald-Laurier Institute's new podcast series in which we explore the implications of an emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, for our friends and allies, and for the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Canada office. Today, we're bringing you a special episode of Double Trouble. This is a republication of an event we did with the American Enterprise Institute in May 8 in Washington, D.C., together with my friend and colleague, Jonathan Berkshire. We talked with Colin Dueck, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, about U.S.-Canada relations and where and how in the world our two countries can work together. We thank American Enterprise Institute for the opportunity to reissue this talk as a part of Double Trouble. So, without further ado, please enjoy our conversation with Colin Dueck at American Enterprise Institute as a special episode for Double Trouble.
All right, welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Colin Dueck. I'm a senior fellow here. Today we're going to discuss the current state of U.S.-Canada relations. Talk a little bit, I think, about Canadian politics and foreign policy as well. Of course, Canada is one of America's oldest and closest allies. This is one of the largest bilateral trading relationships in the world and a border over 5,000 miles long. The common interests, there's a long list of them. Not only trade and border issues, but also the Arctic, counterterrorism, transnational crime, energy, NATO, and beyond. And yet that relationship receives, I think, far less attention inside the Beltway than other parts of the world that are much smaller and more distant. So today we're going to try to make up for that. We're going to focus on Canada and on U.S.-Canada relations. Very happy to welcome my two guests today, Jonathan Berkshire Miller and Balkan Devlen. They are both senior fellows at the Center for North American Prosperity and Security. And Jonathan is also a senior fellow and director of foreign affairs at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute based in Ottawa. Balkan is director of the Transatlantic Program and senior fellow at the same institute. They're both widely published and have a great stellar resumes, so I won't go over all the details, but I'll just say that, that those institutes have done, I think, very good and candid work on the current drift, you might say, in U.S.-Canada relations and what might be done to improve it. And that's one of the things we're going to discuss today. So the format is going to be a conversation over the next hour. I'll start with some questions for them, and then we'll move to the audience. So first of all, I'd just like to ask both of you, and whichever one would like to answer first, for your overall take on Canadian foreign policy today, kind of big picture, under the Trudeau government. Strengths, weaknesses, kind of what's the state of play?
Well, maybe I can go first, and Balkan can correct me on everything that I do wrong. Well, first of all, Colin, thank you, and thank you to AEI for hosting us. It's a real pleasure to be here. I feel Balkan probably can empathize with this, but we're on the road in so many other places, but often we don't get a chance to come down and talk to our friends in Washington. So we're delighted that you've made time for us for this discussion. To the question, Colin, on Canadian foreign policy and how we've thought about things, and particularly this government, I wish I had a positive, rosy outlook. I don't want to start with pessimism, but unfortunately, it's been hard for us to have a clear-minded view on foreign policy, and there's been several reasons for this. I think Canada and Trudeau himself often still mythologizes the old view of Canadian foreign policy. So I'll give you, I promise I won't tell you every story of my childhood, but I'll tell you one story that resonates when I think about this, and I think the Trudeau government still has this syndrome, and previous governments, even if they're conservative, had this syndrome too. So this, when I was a child, we had these things in Canada called heritage commercials, where we would think about the different parts of our history, and one of the heritage commercials that I often point to was peacekeeping. Which, if you talk to any Canadian, we always love to talk about peacekeeping. We see it as the golden era of Canadian foreign policy. And this one commercial had a Canadian peacekeeper with his blue hat UN peacekeeping helmet on. And in between was a Greek Cypriot and a Turkish Cypriot. So this was our peacekeeping mission in Cyprus. And at the time, of course, I think the TV commercial was using a lot of euphemisms, but they had one man with a stick, another with a rock, so no guns, no knives, and the Canadian peacekeeper was in between saying, "I am a Canadian, please put down your weapons." And of course they're like, "Well, sure, the Canadians here, and it's the United Nations, we will put down our weapons." And I'm using this sort of lampooning this analogy, but I think this old mythology that we could look at foreign policy issues as a luxury item, and that Canada could contribute, whether it's in Cyprus, whether it's on certain other missions through multilateral agencies. And then when it came to the real sticky issues, of course, what we're seeing now with the tragic reinvasion of Ukraine, which I'm sure Balkan will talk about, the rise of China and some of the tensions there, tensions in the Middle East, Canada would basically effectively leave that to other players like the United States or allies in Asia or in Europe. So I think we are struggling to get out of this mindset still. I think we're still approaching it in this luxury item status. And you see this often with, and maybe we'll get into this later in the discussion, with defense spending and with principled strategic visions on dealing with these security issues. So from that onset, we are waking up very slowly, whether it's on China, whether it's because of things that are happening now in Europe, but it's taken a very, very long time. And I think there's a lot of impatience in Canada and also amongst our allies.
I'll add maybe two things. One, just to highlight just to follow on to be a little bit more pessimistic even, from Jonathan's. In the last two elections, I don't think we had one single foreign policy debate between the candidates, right? There was a question in 2021 in one of the debates, and I don't even remember what the question was. Forget about any foreign policy discussion. So this government, particularly, but broadly the political environment is not necessarily particularly conducive to think about the foreign and security issues. But that was not necessarily the case historically. If you think about it, and throughout the 20th century, Canadians, spent blood and treasure in both World Wars, the Cold War, deployed significant forces, contribute to both the creation and the maintenance of a liberal international order that Canada and Canadians significantly benefited in terms of prosperity and security. So it was not always, as one of our colleagues, Alexander Lanoshka, in another meeting recently said, it was not always just this peacekeeping and we just show up and keep people apart and we don't really have to worry about much what's going on because we are safe here with three oceans and a friendly giant to the south. There was a recognition that Canada required to do and contribute in a meaningful way to the defense and security of friends and allies because it is contributing to Canadian prosperity and security. That sort of changed from maybe sort of the middle of the Cold War in the 60s. And after the end of Cold War, it was like, okay, we don't even have to worry about that one. Again, three oceans in the United States are fine, and we can continue to coast. But I think that is also slowly changing. Here, normally, you would expect the political elite to lead in terms of taking a much more internationalist take when it comes to foreign affairs. But I would say in the past couple of years, what we witnessed is an increasing recognition within the Canadian public that the world changed, that it is much more dangerous. It is not your grandparents, well, your parents, world that things are fine in 1990s and things are going okay. But that the world is much more dangerous and Canada needs to do more. And the Canadians are increasingly willing to pay the price for that in terms of political capital, economic spending, defense spending, etc. It is, to me, the political elite particularly that is dragging its feet and still thinking that we're still in 1990s and we can get by doing the minimum. I'll just end with a saying that to Canadian scholars who work on Canada, quite Canadian NATO policy, particularly Joseph Jokel and Joanne Sokolsky, who describe Canada as an easy rider, not a free rider, but as an easy rider. And I think that time is over. I think the public recognizes it. earlier and much more seriously than the political class, but the political class will come kicking and screaming, but they will.
That's very good. By the way, I love the image that just a Canadian by his or her existence can get people to beat their swords into plowshares. That's wonderful. So, look, you both alluded to the notion that there's a shift now in Canadian opinion. I think you both suggested it was more popular opinion than elite opinion. I mean, that sounds very hopeful. Say a little bit more about that. I mean, how would that show up in the political system, and why hasn't it yet? Or do you think it is showing up in the political system?
So, I mean, I can have a few points of this, and then Balkan can maybe add in. But I mean, one of the things, Colin, we've seen, and public polling has showed this and has played it out. So even very specific questions. So you ask about our 2% threshold on defense, which is, we've agreed to it for several years, as have other NATO allies. Canadians recognize that they need to do more. You ask Canadians specifically on this, and it's over 65% of Canadians say, yes, we agree that we need to fulfill our obligations. The challenge is, on the leadership side, is actually pushing this forward. So you don't just need a poll, then you need the leadership to actually say, look, I'm responding to the political desire. Previous, and especially prior to Russia's reinvasion, politicians wouldn't even touch this, because what they would hide behind is say, look, the public is not interested in defense spending. They have zero interest. And not only don't they have interest, but this will be a political risk to me if I even bring this up and try to carve away spending from education and from health. We're seeing a huge change in the pendulum. A part of it, of course, is what's happening in Europe. But another big part of it, and maybe we'll get into this later, is the China discussion. I think Canada's views on China and the skepticism on China has shifted dramatically 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, from where it's at today. And Canadians are realizing that maybe not everyone in the world is our friend as we previously had hoped.
I would add maybe one more thing, and that is, yes, the public's view on this is shifting, and the polling we both did as a part of our coordinated in our project a couple of years back, a number of polling that we asked a number of questions on defense and security and spending specifically. Others did the same questions. The trouble is, of course, there are very few polls that ask people to rank or do trade-offs. But when you talk to people, I'm yet to see a trade-off poll where you say, butters guns, kind of approach. People seem to get much more in a visceral sense that soon enough, if you don't have the guns, you cannot have the butter, right? That seems to be at least the recognition when you talk to outside the automobile bubble as well. Am I being hopeful? Perhaps we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But I think it is incumbent on the leadership, whether it's the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, to make the case that why and how Canadian prosperity and security is very tightly connected to how we stand up in the world and support our friends and allies. That is investing in also Canadian security and prosperity here at home, and how that is very closely linked. This is not something out there, some abstract thought about people having champagne and having caviar talk about it. But it's a very close link as a trading nation that Canada needs to pay attention to, and that seems to be seeping to the public much more than what you would sort of assume as the traditional view in Ottawa.
That's great. That's encouraging. Okay, let me zero in on a tough one, Canadian defense spending. And I know that you both have strong feelings about this as well. So obviously the last decade, let's say, increased focus on burden sharing within the NATO alliance. Donald Trump really put it on the agenda, and he may be president again a few months from now. So regardless, it's an issue. How do you see the level of Canadian defense spending now? Where should it be? Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Well, let me sort of go first on this. Right now, it's far below anywhere where we think is acceptable. We're at 1.33%, depending on how you try to fudge the math. We've had a recent defense policy update, which took a long time to come out, which is now projected 1.76% by 2030, but not the 2% threshold. And not only, I mean, of course, the percentage in meeting our NATO commitments, which I should mention is now a floor. It's this is not the ceiling. I mean, the states are doing a lot more. Look at what the Poles are doing. Look what other partners are doing. We shouldn't look at 2% as a mission accomplished target. The bigger issue, I think, is actually capabilities. So if you think of the fundamental mission of a Defense Department is to, number one, to keep Canadians safe and secure and to protect their prosperity, also to contribute to alliances and many of our partners and allies, and then to provide some of the international public goods that we talked about, whether it was with the Cyprus example or other peacekeeping missions. We're unable to sometimes provide task number one or number two, let alone number three. Balkan referenced, I think, in his opening comments about the three oceans. We're a Pacific nation, we're an Atlantic nation, and we're an Arctic nation. But when it comes to our Navy, which used to be the fourth largest in the world, now we have 4 submarines for 3 oceans. And thank you to the British for giving us those lovely old submarines. But now often all of them are in the dry docks. So we end up sometimes having 0 deployable submarines for 3 oceans and ambitions to be a multi-theater power. So clearly this needs to be addressed. We see it as a 4-alarm fire. We don't see this as something that we should maybe gradually address. We think this is fundamental to our interests. And one last visceral example I'll give you is that there tends to be a discussion in Ottawa often of defense spending being the Americans are coming at us again and really want us to do this ahead of whether it's a NATO summit or whether it's a bilateral meeting. But to show that this is critical to Canadian interest, I use an example of a Taiwan contingency as a potential example. There's over 100,000 Canadians in Taiwan. Even our fundamental, in East Asia, even our fundamental obligations to get our citizens out in non-combat evacuations, we do not have those capabilities. We've shown time and time again, whether it was in Lebanon, whether it was in Sudan more recently, we don't have those capabilities to provide those services to Canadian citizens. And we can't always have the expectation of calling our friendly neighbor to the south, or in the Sudanese case, the Germans, to say, can we get on your plane? Or take 90% of your plane for Canadians. So we have to address this and realize that this is really a national security issue and not something we're doing as a favor to our allies.
And I would add that there is, even with the DPU, Defense Policy Update, was recently came out that supposedly would bring the spending to 1.76 by 2029, which, it's a political document. It's supposed to get to 2029, which is basically Pinker promised, elect us again, and we'll do this thing that we're supposed to do in the old 8 years. We didn't, now we're gonna do it. I'm not necessarily going to buy that unless I see the money up there. Even that is very, very little, in the sense that when people complain about 2%, being an artificial target, et cetera, yes, fine, et cetera. We agreed on it as a NATO alliance. Everyone is doing it, trying to get there and trying to get beyond. Why can't we? We are a G7 country, $3 trillion economy, 40 million people, all these natural resources. Why can we not get to 2%? It is not an acceptable thing. And it is also the capabilities issue. I forget who coined, unfortunately, that term, when there's this graphic when they put out in terms of, so 2%, as you know, is one of the criteria, and then 20% in terms of capabilities of that spending, right? There's only one country, which is called in the quadrant of shame, that is under 20% in terms of capability spending, and under 20%, that's Canada.
That's us.
Right? That is not acceptable. And I think what we started to realize, not only our American friends, but our European friends and others, are also being much more blunt about that this is not an acceptable thing. And we have been saying this for years, that we need to be able to do this because our prosperity and security depends on a well-functioning, stable, rules-based order that Canada benefited significantly. We need to do our bit. It was John Manley, I think, who famously said that Canada, when it comes to defense, sometimes is like the guest that goes to the bathroom when the check comes. You can stick around. You can do it once, twice. Third time, nobody will invite you to dinner, right? So there is a recognition, I think, that needs to be done. I think it's much more clear among the bureaucracy and the security and defense bureaucracy. They know, they understand, and they need to do it. We have a recruitment problem in Canadian armed forces, etc. I don't necessarily sense the same sense of urgency in the government that we need to get there now, not 6 years down the road.
One just quick postscript on this too, and I mean, Canadians love multilateralism. I think it's like we have an IV drip of multilateralism into our bloodstreams. But one way to levy pressure on the Canadian political class, and we've seen this because of the recent events, of course, the strategic rise of China and all the challenges that poses, but Russia's revisionism too, is that in the G7 context, for example, we had the Germans and the Japanese for several years underspending on defense. And of course, we need to see this evolve in the coming years to see if the Japanese meet some of the huge commitments that they put forward, or the Germans do. But now we can no longer hide in that G7 club and say, look, you know, the Germans and the Japanese aren't doing much either, and the Italians are the Italians. Now a lot of folks in that club are taking national security much more seriously. So the places to hide are becoming less and less, and NATO is the same thing. Whether it's a quadrant of shame or whether it's the 2% threshold, there's less and less countries, let alone G7 countries, that are in this category. So I think Canada's starting to read the room a little bit, and realize that it doesn't want to be left in the corner and be like, okay, we're going to be called out.
Let me proceed to some regional challenges. I think you mentioned the Arctic. I find this really interesting. It's interesting for several reasons. You've got this increased Chinese presence, right? High hopes for Chinese trade through the Arctic. You've got Russian heavy icebreakers. I think they far outnumber any other country in that area. Potentially, you could have much closer cooperation between Canada and the US. I'm not sure Americans realize Canada looks at the Arctic with great jealousy, right? So they're not necessarily on the same page as the US. So tell us, what are some of the tensions? What are the issues? How could it be improved in relation to Arctic defense?
I would say two things. One, I think there is an increasing recognition that the challenges we face in the North American Arctic is slightly different than the European Arctic. When I talk to people who work on this, and probably forgot more than I ever know about it, they tell me that, for example, with the climate change, the Eurasian Arctic, the Russian Arctic, particularly the Eastern Seaway, became much more navigable. But that's not necessarily the case when it comes to Northwest Passage. The ice is much more, stable in a way. The climate change will make it less stable, which means floating ice, which makes it even more dangerous, more treacherous for passage, etc. So the challenges that we will face are going to be different. That doesn't mean that we're not, or we shouldn't be concerned about it. We talked about it and did a number of events when it comes to particularly Russia and China, and how they cooperate in the Arctic, not only sort of the European and Eurasian Arctic, high north, but also in what we might consider sort of North American Arctic. And Canada for years, and still, I mean, it's changing, but for years was very reluctant to have sort of either NATO or international involvement here. Of course, we have the gentleman's agreement. They agree to disagree when it comes to Northwest Passage, whether it's international waters or Canadian territorial waters, and that continue to be the issue. But I think there is a recognition broadly within Canada, within the defense industry, but also the defense establishment, but also within the government more broadly, that as the Chinese are particularly paying much more attention to the Arctic, and now that finally the Russians seem to be less reluctant to involve the Chinese. I mean, that was, for years, to me at least, was the canary in the Arctic mine when it comes to Russian-Chinese relationship. Everywhere else, they tend to cooperate quite well. In the Arctic, Russians would like to keep the Chinese apart. In a way, that's slowly changed. Now they did a military exercise last year, signed a MOU between their coast guards, etc. So you see much more Chinese presence, will be seeing much more Chinese presence in the Arctic. And if they start giving submarine technology, their advanced stuff, with their much more silent submarine technologies, the Russians, to the Chinese, that we might end up seeing in the next 5 years or whatever, Chinese subs up in the north. That means that the Americans are much more concerned about the threats coming through, the hypersonics, the surveillance, the undersea cables, et cetera, which means that Canada actually needs to do much more about surveillance, about reconnaissance, about seeing and knowing and situational awareness, pan-domain awareness in the Arctic. And that's why the defense policy update very heavily focused on those capabilities in the North, in the Arctic, because we realize that we can no longer just rely on business as usual, and this will be a crucial component for North American security, and therefore we need to do more.
Two just quick points on the Arctic as well. I mean, we've finally concluded one of our most long-standing and vicious and violent territorial disputes in the Arctic with our Danish friends. The perilous journey to go to Hans Island and swap whiskey bottles. But in all seriousness, I think you're right, Balkan. I think when we think of Arctic security now, we've transformed our mindset. Traditionally, it used to be very much sovereignty. We didn't want to have any discussion of this as a potential regional security or international security issue. That's changed, of course, with NATO being welcomed and the Secretary General actually visiting up in the Arctic. The other interesting point, and the second point that I think is interesting, is not even on traditional security, but on infrastructure and investment. The Arctic needs a lot of infrastructure investment, and the type of foreign offers that we're seeing, maybe predictably so, those who want to come in with briefcases of money are not necessarily the ones that we want to come in. So number one, we're having to work very closely on our investment protection and controls, and working with First Nations in the region to ensure that they're not put in compromising positions and our national security and critical infrastructure isn't compromised. But that also leads to the opportunity, and I actually think the imperative for a lot of our international partners, including the United States, to work with us in developing a lot of the infrastructure in the Arctic and in the High North, because we do not have the resources to do it alone. And it's much better to have the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Americans to help us out on some of these joint ventures than to have shell companies from China and other places, which would be delighted to have as many gold mines or critical infrastructure mines that they could procure.
That's a good point. Okay, moving to China, maybe more generally, Asia Pacific. You've both alluded to the rise of China. Canada's position in the region is worth discussing. It's not part of the new submarine deal. Does a lot of trade with a long list of Pacific nations, including China, but also allies like Japan. How do you see the challenge from China changing Canadian foreign policy, and what more remains to be done?
So on China, I mean, it's interesting to see how the debate has shifted. And one of the ways that I always demonstrate how this has shifted is this used to be a discussion like we'd have today, where I often call it, not saying it's the nodding head discussion, but a lot of us are interested in this, engaged in this, have been focused on China or foreign policy. The mom and pops, so actually this resonating with those who are not focused on foreign policy, weren't as steely focused on the challenges that China poses. This fundamentally changed recently in Canada, and there were a few drivers for this. The first driver was the visceral detention of our citizens that we call the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. That transformed the China relationship and a lot of the negative tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party from something that we discuss in the think tank circles or at international conferences to the front page of Canadian newspapers consistently for over 3 years. So that made the China skepticism that was probably already there, and some of the polling was bearing out, to being a much longer issue. And that's been complemented with political interference discussions, that's been complemented with worry about next generation carriers like Huawei. So this has created the sort of pressure, the political pressure, to really take China seriously, or if you want to frame it as an awakening. The challenge, and I think this is something we often say, is that our strategic reality when it comes to Asia, and especially when it comes to China, is very different from some of our allies like Australia. We like to think of ourselves in a similar vantage point, but actually the vulnerability and exposure to China is much, much less. When you think of the trading relationship that Australia has, for example, to China versus Canada, we're at, may not have the statistics completely accurate, but we're at more like 6 to 7% of our trading relationship with China, 64% with the United States. By head over heels, our economic and security ties are fundamentally in North America. Doesn't mean that we don't have engagements in China or desire to improve that, but we do not have that exposure. So that has led us gradually, and too slow for my liking, to engage with the rest of the part of Asia and the Indo-Pacific, like Japan, like South Korea. But my last point on this, and for us to be successful in this part of the world, I think we have to make sure that we have that sequencing right, and that we don't frame the engagement with the Japans and South Koreas and ASEANs of the world by just saying, look, we're finally worried about China too. We know you've been worried about China for a long time and have been telling us about this. Now we want to be your friends. I think it has to go the other way and say, look, we share a lot with Japan, we share a lot with South Korea. ASEAN's complicated, but there's ways that we want to engage with you, and we understand the China factor, and we want to find ways to make sure that you have better infrastructure, et cetera, rather than framing it purely as, you're worried about China, what can we do to help you on that? So I think that's the framing and the sequencing and the narrative that I think Canada's still working through. And a lot of it's just the fact that we just haven't been in the region long enough. We've been sort of a bit of an absentee figure at a lot of these forums for too long.
And I would add that, we need to also think about what are our leverage points. What is the niche that Canada can contribute to the security and prosperity of our friends and allies in the region? What we can do, what we can bring to the table when it comes to either resisting pressure from China for our friends and allies in the region, or offering alternatives to it. And when you look at what Canada has, it really sort of comes down to energy and food resources. Critical minerals is of course part of it, but our major allies in the region, Japan and South Korea, very much depends on importation, both food and energy resources. And Canada can and should play a much bigger role, be it in LNG, be it in providing strategic food reserves, be it being a place where you can actually bring in minerals and other things. So I think we need to figure out what is the niche that Canada needs to engage in the Pacific to be able to bring something to the table that would actually make both Canada secure and more prosperous, but also for our allies and partners as well.
So just to pick up on a couple of these points, I think you were suggesting that Canada is about 10 times as reliant on the US when it comes to trade as it is on China. Mm-hmm. So in a way, Canada's single biggest foreign interest is the United States.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about that. The Biden administration. We haven't talked about trade issues. Obviously, with Trump, they were rocky. How would you assess current economic relations, and for that matter, energy? Balkan, you mentioned energy, with the current administration. And what would, for lack of a better way to put it, what would Canada like to see done differently?
Well, I can go first on this. And I think we talked a little bit before, Colin, before this session on this, that I think there was a bit of course, the Trudeau-Trump relationship was not good. I think there's no other way to frame this. There was an oil and water relationship, and we may see that relationship again. So there was a lot of hope, I think, in Ottawa, or relief, that they had somebody else to deal with. Of course, the Liberal Party, the Democratic parties came into power. There was also a lot of positive feeling between the Obama administration and the personal relationship between Obama and Trudeau. So there was a hope. And I think with a lot of the political appointees in the administration, that things maybe you get in your DeLorean and you go back in time and you're like, well, maybe things will be better. The reality, I think, has been very different, whether it's on trade, whether it's on national security. Yes, the Biden administration, I think, has been as nice to us as possible on the defense spending, and I think that may change ahead of the NATO summit. But I think those structural issues of what the Americans care about and what they expect of Canada has not gone away. I think that the challenge going forward will be for us to see this dynamic, and regardless, what we often talk about at the Institute is regardless of what happens this fall, control what we can control. So think about the things, whether it's on trade, the areas that we want to protect, of course, the new NAFTA, national security, making steps to do more on capabilities and defense spending. If we can control what we control, we'll set ourselves up in the best possible position. Of course, it's going to be a different administration that we may have to deal with, but this is the fundamental issue that I think we've obsessed too much in Ottawa, is who's in power, and this is fundamentally going to shift things. Actually, the things that America cares about are pretty constant, and we just haven't done a great job of signaling that to ourselves.
And I would add on the energy component, I think there was, at least when you look at it more broadly, there was a sense of disappointment when it comes to the Keystone XL cancellation, etc. But I think the expectation, but two things. First, as you point out, this is an existential relationship for Canada, right? Maintaining friendly, good, excellent relations with the United States, regardless of what administration you have, is key for Canadian prosperity and security. As the saying goes, Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not. That's true. That is the case. So I think the key will be, when it comes to trade and energies, I think two parts. One, we need to be able to talk with our American friends and say that, look, when you think about energy security, energy transition, be it LNG, be it oil, be it hydrogen, be it uranium, whatever have you, whatever you're talking about. Think North America rather than America, right? And Canada can be a solution to the problems that the United States has. And I think that's number one, that we need to sort of think through an energy, a much more closer energy partnership between two countries. And the second thing is, and this is the thing that we keep coming back, one cannot divorce the developments and thinking and spending and contributions on defense and security from the trade anymore. It's no longer possible, I think, to be able to say to the Americans, we're just going to do the trade thing and our trade deals going on, but defense, sorry about that. This is not our thing. I think the expectation on the American side, and rightly so, would be that Canada pulls its weight when it comes to the defense of North America much more seriously, and we need to be able to do that in order to make sure that we are a good friend and ally, that we actually could benefit, engaging and providing solutions to the problems of both countries.
So I have to ask one or two questions about Canadian politics. I don't know what you can tell me, but I'm curious. So I just checked this morning. I see that the Liberals under Trudeau are at about 24%. The Tories are at about 44%. This is really stunning, actually. The best estimates are this would be a landslide victory for the Conservatives. Anything could happen. It's politics, right? But there's been a steady trend for a long time where the Tories have been ahead. Okay, my question to you is, the new Tory leader is obviously doing very well politically. I haven't heard much about his foreign policy views or defense, and I don't expect it to be necessarily a top issue, but you've both said that public opinion has changed. There's maybe the possibility on defense and on China. It seems to me the Tories in Canada emphasize pride in Canadian military history, if any party does, right? World War I, World War II. Is that going to translate into something concrete, or what can we expect to see if they win an election next year?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to put the crystal ball in too, but I remember having the crystal ball and failing several times before on elections. But on foreign policy, it's something we think about every day. We think because as much as we've expressed frustration and cynicism about some of the foreign policy choices and defense choices that we've made, I also do have concerns and worries as well. The positive side first, I think that there's a number of key individuals and advisors that I think do understand the foreign policy imperatives, whether it's on China, whether it's on defense.
You're talking on the Conservative
in the Conservative
side,
Party.
Okay.
That I think that they do understand a realistic foreign policy will take some investments. The challenge is the headwinds economically. So as Balkan mentioned, whether it was the last election and even previous elections, foreign policy doesn't play much, I know, in most elections, but especially in Canadian elections. So this election will not be won and lost on foreign policy. I hope there's at least a foreign policy debate, because this will be the first election post Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. But I'm not optimistic that foreign policy will play a big role. The second thing is actually dollars and cents. So I think Pierre Poilievre has very clearly noted that every dollar going out, that we need to make sure that we're spending a dollar in, dollar out. So the idea of a windfall of money coming for defense or for new embassies overseas, I don't think it's going to be as simple as that. So I think this goes back to the idea of connecting foreign policy to Canadians, connecting this attention of why these issues matter to Main Street in Canada. And that's going to be one of the fundamental challenges. It's easy to find reasons to critique regimes like that in Beijing or in Moscow, but I think fundamentally this is the sort of challenge we have to overcome. Canadians are going through a housing crisis. We're going through inflationary challenges like the United States is as well. There's a number of social pressures on Canadians that will take that primary toll. So how do we sort of elevate foreign policy discussion and how much attention? I think that's the fundamental challenge.
And I would add two things. I think, again, crystal balls are hard to figure out. But looking at what the Conservatives have been making the case and key advisors around Pierre Poilievre making the case, I would expect two things. One, that there will be an increasing focus on anything to do with energy, right? LNG, uranium, hydrogen, oil, and how Canada can get, how the Canadian government could help to get the Canadian resources, energy and agriculture and critical minerals, to international markets, to our friends and allies, and provide the support for both our Indo-Pacific allies, but also our European allies, in reducing their reliance on Russian LNG, in ensuring that they have a steady supply of energy resources, etc. That would, I think, will be a fundamental tenet of any Conservative government coming to power. The second one, this is a bit of on the commercial side of it. 3-4 years ago, Jonathan co-authored a report called From Middle to Major Power for MLI. It was published in, I think it was in 2020.
Yeah.
Co-authored with Jeff Collins, who is at DND right now, and Shuvaloy Majumdar, who is right now an MP from Conservative Party at Calgary. He used to be a key advisor to Stephen Harper during his government. And a lot of those pieces in that report that is written, that Jonathan and Shuv and Jeff co-authored, I think would give a good sense of what the Conservative foreign policy could look like. As a recent MP, Shuv is, I would say, one of the key MPs around Pierre Poilievre, and I think if you want to understand where the government might be going and what the priorities are, I think that might be a good place to look at.
I think one last postscript on this too, and I think this potentially could be a positive development, is this, we talked about the IV drip of multilateralism. We're not going to see an immediate pull away from that, but I hope that there probably will be a difference of this all friends to all people on all issues sort of foreign policy, that we can be in a room of 200 and everyone is equal, everyone's our friend on all issues. Clearly, that is not the case internationally. I think a new Conservative government, I think, will be much more focused on certain arrangements and alignments. I think they would be interested in things like AUKUS Pillar 2. I think that they potentially would be interested in other architecture like Quad Plus in the Indo-Pacific, in addition to reinforcing our credibility in alliances like NATO, et cetera. So I think going back to the basics, I think, is what you can expect a lot.
Yeah. And looking at the report this morning, before I come actually, I noticed that several of the recommendations that you guys made back 4 years ago are already started to be sort of even picked up by the Liberal government, including the establishment of a National Security Council, the instituting a National Security Strategy Review, which in the DPU they announced, the reconsidering Canadian participation in Asian investment, infrastructure investment bank, etc. So a number of things that have been coming out. I think the recognition that the world changed, Canadian interests need to be defended in a much more muscular way, and we need to be much more selective and intentional about our engagement with others, with international organizations, rather than convention, focusing on the intention, etc. I think it's seeping through even in the current government.
It strikes me the last time the Tories were in power, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, for example, on Israel, was pro-Israel. Right? His view was this isn't all that complicated. It's not like we have 200 equal, morally equal partners. Trudeau, I think, is a little more inclined to that point of view. Is that something that could shift? Or how do you think Canadian policy could shift in the Middle East, if at all?
Well, I think, one of the challenges that we find on this, and even predating October 7th, of course, the horrific attacks and what's followed, is that we have failed to recognize the evolution of the interest and the agency of states in the Middle East. So whether it's the Abraham Accords, whether it's other developments in the region, we had a very outdated view of where the Middle East, number one, is right now, but where it's going. So that is one of the challenges that, be it the Liberals, and we hope if the Conservatives come into power that they think about this as well, is not think about it through the lens of one issue, but think about the dynamic things that are happening, number one, intra-Middle East, but also Middle East with partners outside. So some of the multilaterals I find fascinating, for example, is what India is doing in the Middle East, like how India is engaging with the Emiratis and with the Israelis. I think that we have a very sort of fishbowl, siloed view of the way that we think of Middle Eastern issues, rather than seeing that interconnectivity. So, for example, when thinking about Red Sea security, of course, it's absolutely integrated with transatlantic security and the supply chains in the Indo-Pacific, rather than seeing this as something, okay, what's our position on Israel and Palestine or Gaza?
Okay.